Hello and welcome to PHIL-7003 at Fanshawe College University Philosophy. It is the winter of 2022, and I'm your instructor, Dr. Nick McGinnis, recording from my messy basement office. This is week 4 in our first video, well, the first one that I'm going to be recording this semester. I am feeling pretty recovered from my bout with COVID-19. Had a breakthrough infection, I think they're called, but it wasn't that bad, just about a week of, fatigue, some muscle soreness, but I'm back, and the plan is, so I'm going to start at week 4, because that's the week we just finished, and then I'm going to start catching up. I'm going to do weeks 4 and 5 right away. Hopefully I'm going to be able to do these back-to-back recordings, and then over the following week, I'm going to catch up and do weeks 1, 2, and 3, and then we'll be all caught up, and I can start week 6. So hopefully these videos will be useful to you. I'm trying to keep them, half an hour to an hour long tops. This week, week 4, Frege, and the philosophy of language might be a little bit longer than usual, just because there's a lot of content this specific week. But let's get started. In terms of where we are in the class, I just want to remind you that, of course, discussion forum contributions are worth 10% of your grade. So I have been in the discussion forums. I am reading. I'm occasionally replying to some of the comments. I'm definitely enjoying seeing people's thoughts and reflections and contributions there in the discussion forum. So keep those up. That's great. Your first short essay is due week 6. That means for this winter semester, it is due February, I think it's the 18th. And of course, email me if you have any questions or concerns. So let's talk a little bit about this week's topic, and the topic, in fact, for the next few weeks, which is the philosophy of language. The linguistic turn, which is kind of a historical period coined by Richard Rorty here, Essays in Philosophical Method, The Linguistic Turn. It's conceptualized as a movement in kind of early 20th century philosophy. So we're thinking about the period, really it's not 20th, it's also part of the kind of the 19th. Really we're talking like 1880s all the way to, I'd say right up until 1970, 1980, where the study of language and the study of the logic of language became the dominant means of philosophical method in terms of trying to solve philosophical, metaphysical problems. So for the next few weeks, we'll be looking closely at this notion of the linguistic turn, of the study of language as the primary method for solving philosophical problems. So there's lots of different approaches in this tradition, as you will see. So I'm just going to kind of talk about 4, and what I'm going to be doing here is giving a very simplified approach, of course, of these 4 traditions. We're talking about 100 years of very intensive work by dozens and dozens of people, hundreds of people. So in this kind of simplified history, I'm going to be looking at, well, first, kind of Frege, Russell, and the logical empiricists, which I'm going to call kind of a logic-first approach. Then we're going to be looking at something called the modal / kind of causal views associated with Saul Kripke and Ruth Barkin Marcus. Let me just move here, let's cover up Russell and Frege up here. So down here, these two, this is Kripke, he's still alive. Ruth Barkin Marcus, she died recently-ish, I think the last 10 years or so. Modal, causal, if you're not sure what these words mean in terms of language, I'll explain it when we get to that week's module. The third view we're going to look at is the ordinary language school. The slogan there, sometimes meaning is use. It's kind of a form of, I guess, descriptivism, where we're just going to be describing the patterns of natural language, sometimes also called the Oxford School. Here, Wittgenstein and Austin and other members of this kind of ordinary language Oxford School philosophers are the main representatives. And finally, we're going to close up with the kind of cognitive science / naturalistic view associated with the generativist program, aka the linguistic views of Noam Chomsky down here. Naturalistic kind of means we're going to view language as a natural phenomenon, and it's not really within the domain of philosophy exactly. We should study language the same way we'd study any other scientific phenomenon. In fact, Chomsky's argument goes to all mental phenomena. It is no different than any other branch of science. There's nothing really different here. So the readings can be long and technical. Frege especially, I just have the first 6 pages is more than enough to get a sense of what's going on here. I do encourage you to have a look at them. This is the university level course, so I've set this up to kind of mirror an intro university seminar, which is primary sources, right? I didn't assign a textbook. I assigned primary sources, which is the writings of the philosophers themselves, and we're going to be writing essays and exams, again, just like you'd expect to see in a, class that you'd be studying with a philosophy department at university. So in the next 10 slides or so, I'm just going to kind of introduce the idea of the philosophy of language. It's the area I specialized in while I was studying for my master's and my PhD. I might go a little bit overboard in terms of technical detail because it's what I'm interested in. But I guess what I want to say is the reason I was interested in it is that understanding the kind of relationship between language, between the concepts we are, expressing through our language, and then the reality the language and the concepts are supposed to be about might help solve, or as Wittgenstein wanted to put it, dissolve, get rid of, remove problems that just arise because of linguistic confusion. So maybe some things we thought were philosophical problems aren't in fact problems. They're just arising because of our misuse of language. So let's talk about language and philosophy. You might still be thinking to yourself, why is language itself, the means we use to express our ideas, so crucial to philosophy that we got stuck on it for about 100 years, from 1880 to 1980 or so? Well, that's a great question. And let's start by asking ourselves another question. Well, what is language? Coffee. No, language is not coffee. I just need coffee to talk about language. As you could tell, I haven't got a lot of sleep. Because, kids don't really get affected by COVID. So while my wife and I were just exhausted and sore and the worst, the kids were like, let's go do things. So none of it, we're tired. So what is language? All right, on the most basic level, a language is any kind of set of symbols. And I don't mean written symbols. I don't mean to say, look, the written language means it's a language. A symbol can also be something that is only ever spoken aloud. But for the purposes of our initial discussion, I think it'll be easier if we conceptualize of symbols as something we write down, as a mark on a piece of paper, for example. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that. But not every set of symbols is a language either. So merely having symbols doesn't imply that there's a language there. It doesn't imply that there's meaning, right? If I have a bunch of scratches on paper, even if I have rules for moving around the scratches on paper, it doesn't mean we have a language here, because the symbols should always mean something. And this idea, this notion of meaning, is precisely where things get really tricky. It's very difficult to define meaning. Our first attempt, the intuitive answer might be, well, a symbol can stand for an object in reality. So language, in our first definition, is a set of symbols that represent objects in reality. So I could introduce a written symbol that stands for a cat, or I could introduce a spoken symbol, the sound cat, and I'm talking about cats. Knowledge of these symbols makes it possible to use them, to use language to communicate information to each other about reality. So notice this little image here. Let me just move myself again here. I'm down here now. Right, fish have gills. If I say fish have gills, what am I talking about? I'm talking about the thing, fish. If I say fish has 4 letters, I'm not talking fish don't have 4 letters, right? They swim around, they don't have any letters at all. But the word fish has 4 letters. So I can talk about the word, or I can talk about the thing in language. right? I could say fish names a word of English also, so I can go up a couple like meta levels here, right? So we're going to make a distinction between, right, the symbol and the thing the symbol is talking about. So our definition here is roughly this. What is language? Well, it's a system. It has to be a system because it has to be systematic in the sense that we need rules to be able to communicate with each other. So it's a system of meaningful symbols that, once known, can be used to communicate information. So all these aspects are going to be really crucial here. We have a system of symbols that, once we know them, we can use them to communicate information. And competing views of language will emphasize different aspects of this kind of definition, this rough and ready definition I just gave. Now, some will emphasize the kind of system aspect of it. To understand language, we must understand the logic of language. This is what we're going to start with this week with Frege and Russell. Others will emphasize this kind of symbol, meaningful symbol aspect. To understand language requires understanding the link between the symbols and what the symbols represent, or maybe, to use their terminology, Kripke's terminology especially, what the symbol refers to. So reference is the kind of the most important thing to focus on. What are my words about? Moving on, another influential view focuses on this kind of use of language as really essential, because we are using language to do something. Languages can't be separated from this kind of social or communal aspect. It's not just a matter of associating symbols with things out there in reality, or even understanding the rules that we kind of follow. It's of investigating the many things we actually end up doing with our language to each other, with each other, right? Or we're asking, ordering, we're imagining things, we're coining new terms constantly. We are creatures that invent and create new forms of language. We do things like joke and make allusions, write poetry, metaphor, fiction. So the uses of language really are as varied as the types of human activity there are. So that's what we should be focusing on. And finally, our last view focuses on this notion of the knowledge of language, because we have to know the system. And what Chomsky is going to say here, in terms of his naturalistic approach to language, is that we should understand language the way we would understand any other aspect of cognition, which is that if you want to do cognitive science, you want to do psychology, you study a brain, essentially. Language is something in the head. Symbols are paired with mental images, or maybe there's like a language of thought. You're thinking thoughts, and your brain is processing thoughts, and that's what we should be investigating. Some linguists would go so far as to argue that language is not an abstract set of symbols you learn. It's an innate, evolved biological capacity. You don't need to teach children to talk. You need to teach children to read and write. That's something you learn. But children don't learn language. They kind of develop one spontaneously. I have a 2-year-old at home right now, and that 2-year-old is a linguistic wizard, right? The sentences that come out of her mouth. And she just is around language and develops a language. I didn't have to sit her down and say, okay, these are words, these are verbs, here's a sentence, the way I would have to teach a child to read and write. So it's going to be really different for the naturalists, who focuses on knowledge of language, and this knowledge is going to be a very interesting kind of knowledge. It is something that you're not taught, but you kind of just develop. And how this develops and what's going on in the brain when it develops are going to be the important questions about language, not like what the words are about in the world. And we'll get into all this. Don't worry. We're already at 15 minutes. Let's talk a little bit more about this idea of language by making... I'm going to introduce this really important distinction, right, between syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. So let's talk about that. Hunched over a little bit here because I think my mic is too low. There we go. So languages have meaning, but meaning itself has levels. So I'm going to take off my sweater here. Okay. Philosophers, linguists, logicians, pretty much everyone distinguishes between kind of 3 levels of meaning. The first level of syntax, then semantics, and then something called pragmatics. You might have heard about the syntax and semantics distinction before. Pragmatics is a little more technical, but it's really, all the three levels are pretty easy to understand. So let's start with syntax. What is syntax? Syntax has to do with the rules governing the structure of the parts of the sentence itself, right? How the parts of a sentence are arranged together to form a meaningful whole, right? Think just about the word order. Word order is part of syntax, right? Consider these three sentences, right? The bunny is on the pancake. Sentence 2, the pancake is on the bunny. So in sentence 1 and 2, right, we have the same words. Exact same words are being used, but the meaning is different. In one of them, there's a bunny on a pancake. The other one, there's a pancake on a bunny. This is a reference to a very old internet meme from 20 years ago. But the point is, word order changes what the subject and the object is. Who's on what. Notice sentence 3, though. Bunny on is pancake the. Now, bunny on is pancake the is not a sentence, even though it has the exact same words as 1 and 2. Why is it not a sentence? Well, the parts are not arranged in an order that make for a meaningful whole. Right? Now, in English, the word order, this is not true of every language, but in English, the word order syntax is subject, verb, object. The bunny, subject. So what is it about the bunny? Verb. Well, the bunny is on. What is it on? Object, pancake. Bunny's on the pancake. 3, because it violates all the rules of syntax, is meaningless. And different languages, of course, will have different, for example, word order syntaxes. So that's an example of syntax. Now, why talk about this? Purely logical analysis of the syntax can actually help us understand the meaning of things. In fact, there were very heroic efforts throughout the 20th century to get as much of language as possible out of syntax and then a little bit of reference on top. Think about the word and. The word and can be analyzed as a strictly logical operator that could be reduced to its syntax. So I'm going to get a little bit abstract with you here, but let's pretend, let's pretend you and me that P and Q are in fact variables. A variable in math, of course, can take many values, and in this case, they're going to be standing in for any sentence that can be true or false. For example, it is raining. Now, it is raining could be true or false. I look outside. False, it is not raining. It's not snowing. Beautiful blue sky today, right? So it is raining can be true or false. So the meaning of and can be given syntactically. I'm going to give it to you in English, right? But it doesn't, right? We can do it slightly differently. But the point is the sentence P and Q is true if and only if P is true, the sentence P is true, and the sentence Q is true. So if I'm going to say, here's two sentences, it is raining, and I don't know, what's another thing that's probably not true? I'm eating a sandwich right now. It is raining and I am eating a sandwich. That'll be true if and only if both are true. It is raining and I am eating a sandwich. It is not raining, I'm not eating a sandwich, the sentence is false. Notice that if both of them have to be true, it is raining and I'm drinking some coffee. That's also false because it is not raining and I'm drinking coffee, even though I am drinking a coffee. So the sentence, any sentence using and is going to be true only if it is joining together two sentences that are also true. Or, if you've ever done kind of computer science 101, you might have seen kind of these variables here given a truth table or like binary operators. So we have P and Q are two sentences, true, 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 otherwise false. Right? The and given together. This is a little symbol here, this little half triangle, upside down V, whatever you call it. This is an and operator symbol. So P and Q, when is it true? Only when both P and Q are true, otherwise it's false. Now you might be objecting, it seems like you're giving me a lot of semantics as you're giving this definition here. Yes and no. So as I'm explaining it, yeah, I'm using a lot of English. We might think of that as a meta language of explanation. Okay, forget I said that. But the point kind of is that this is a syntactic breakdown in the sense that, if you think about your computer, or if you think about the circuits in your phone, your tablet, your PS5, if you're lucky enough to have one, right? The logic gates and circuits in there are basically using these principles to do all kinds of cool math and other functions, which is that we're reducing, right? This can be implemented by a mechanical switch or electronic switch. And if you're able to implement the idea using a mechanism, then it's syntax. So the meaning of and, which is an English expression, can be reduced to a mechanism that we can implement as a kind of gate or switch in a computer, or even you can make a logic gate out of anything. So we've reduced and to syntax. Can we reduce all of meaning to a syntactical logical analysis? Look, probably not. Maybe we can get pretty far. So the fundamental question, and again, I'm simplifying tremendously here, but if you really want to kind of go down to the fundamental approach of the logical investigation of language, we're going to try to do this as far as we can. Try and break down language to something that looks like syntactic logical analysis. Now, let's moving on from syntax, let's talk about semantics. So semantics is where meaning, as we kind of commonly every day understand meaning, that's where it comes in. How symbols and rules governing the symbols come to be about something out there in reality. So semantics is the study of just the literal meaning, right? Do symbols merely stand for or refer to entities in the world? Is that all meaning is? Like a word is kind of a pointer. It says, like, I say cat, I mean, like, oh, there, cat. I mean, that seems like a really good proposal. But as Plato noted, fictional beings and abstractions will pose all kinds of metaphysical problems, right? Which is kind of why, in a way, we started with the metaphysics of things like numbers, because if the meaning in language is really just kind of a pointer to real-world objects, when I say 3, do I mean like the Platonic 3? What am I talking about? What about justice? What is the city of London? Is it its geography, its inhabitants, its laws? Can all of London burn down and be rebuilt elsewhere and still be London? What about Santa Claus? What are we talking about? There's no real entity? What about fictional things? What about Harry Potter? A theory of meaning that gets involved with a theory that meaning is reference will get involved in really deep questions of epistemology, ontology, metaphysics right away. Now, some philosophers are like, great, these are solvable problems. But notice that it's going to be a very different set of problems than if we have a purely logical, syntactical approach. And if we're going to talk about meaning at the semantic level, and especially think of it as a representational theory that refers to objects in reality, that we're pointing to things. When I say cat, I mean cats. When I say justice, I mean justice. I say, the square root of 2. My square root of 2. We're not just going to be having metaphysical and ontological puzzles. We're also going to be asking ourselves really deep questions about the nature of consciousness. Because solving the puzzle of meaning as being about the world also kind of implies, and you might not have noticed this, a rather large and vexing question called the hard problem of consciousness. This is a typical kind of philosopher joke in a way, the hard problem. It's not just it's an extremely hard problem. The hard problem of consciousness, roughly explaining how a configuration of matter can give rise to consciousness, to what we sometimes call intentionality, which is just the ability of a mind to have thoughts about something. Now, this might not seem super mysterious. Of course, we have thoughts about stuff all the time, but consider the humble thermostat, right? You're adjusting the temperature. And I can set the heat to, I don't know, 20 Celsius, put on a sweater if you're cold, and the thermometer will detect the temperature, and the thermometer will shut off the heat when the desired temperature is reached, right? So there's this kind of like reliable causal mechanical connection between the actual temperature, 20 Celsius, and the thermostat's heat detection mechanism, which in old school thermostats was typically like a metal coil that would expand and contract. So it can represent the temperature in this coil and use the information to control the heat. I hear it click off, and I think, oh, that click means, notice, that click means is 20 Celsius. We talk like this all the time. That click means it is 20 Celsius. But the mere fact that a thermostat has a causal functional relation that represents temperature doesn't entail that the thermostat knows it's 20 Celsius. The thermostat doesn't know anything the way you and I do. Right? The same way a vending machine doesn't know that I put $1 in. It has some kind of mechanism that that knows a dollar coin, or like can detect a dollar coin. But if I make a fake metal piece that trips up its mechanism, it'll still think it has $1, right? It doesn't think anything. Human beings use, as philosopher Dan Dennett once said, the intentional stance constantly. We assume computers think. The thermostat knows, but it doesn't actually. It's a mechanism. But we are not mechanisms. We know and we mean things. So a theory that says human meaning is a bit like a thermostat's meaning for many philosophers will just be a non-starter, because we are different than thermostats. My relationship to knowledge is not the thermostat's relationship to temperature, for example. I'm not a robot. In other words, I can have thoughts about something, but a thermostat does not. So whatever meaning is, it can't only be a causal functional representation to an environment. Right? The thermostat has this reliable causal connection to the temperature. But no matter how fancy your thermometer is, it doesn't know or understand what it's doing, right? It's just a mechanism. Now, a lot of students, when I make this point about the relationship between consciousness and meaning, sometimes say, well, what if you had a really complicated mechanism? Well, wouldn't like AI be an example? How do we know that a computer doesn't know if it's really, really sophisticated? We're going to be absolutely talking about that, I promise you. So hold that thought. That's a good one. We will be talking about that. All right, there's one more level to consider. And that level is pragmatics. So pragmatic, of course, means something like, in common speech, very pragmatic means it's kind of realistic or it's useful. But in linguistics, pragmatic has a very specific meaning. It's what context contributes to meaning. I know I'm throwing so many concepts at you today, but pragmatics is what the context contributes to meaning, right? Because sometimes syntax and semantics are insufficient to tell us what someone meant. Pragmatics bridges that gap. Okay, so sarcasm can be used to mean the opposite of what one has actually literally said. Suppose, again, it's pouring rain outside, and you say, oh, it's beautiful outside today. Isn't it beautiful outside today? Right. What I mean is the opposite here. Right? I'm using a sarcastic tone of voice. So pragmatics is how the context of my saying so contributes to the meaning. The context would be the tone of my voice and the environmental information. We can all see it's raining. I'm using, oh, it's beautiful outside. Right. Obviously, I'm being sarcastic. So I actually mean the opposite. Sarcasm, there's been work on this because, of course, basically it works by flouting the norms of regular conversation, right? So generally, people don't say things that are obviously false, generally speaking. Of course, the internet has sort of challenged that. But, okay, we're not talking about that. But generally, if you're just hanging around and if I say, oh, it's beautiful outside today, but it's not beautiful, this violation of the conversational norm implies I mean something other than what I literally said. All right, so generally speaking, sarcasm will work by like, oh, okay, he's saying he's violating a norm of conversation. Normally people don't say things that are outrageously false. Oh, he's being sarcastic. Right, okay, so that's what's happening. So he means something different than what they literally said. And that's pretty contextual. This is not a function of syntax or semantics. It's not about the word order. It's not about the logic of, the words. It's not about the literal meaning of raining. It's about the context, the way in which I said it, and the environmental features such as the fact that it is in fact raining. So our use theories, ordinary language, whatever you want to call them, Wittgenstein, that guy, it will really focus on this pragmatic aspect, how we use language in a specific context, meaning every instance of meaning can only be analyzed in the context of an actual piece of usage. Right? So every utterance, every sentence we write, we speak, has to be analyzed in its context. We can't separate out from this context. In a way, every sentence will have an absolutely unique meaning because it will have an absolutely unique context. Another example of pragmatics is not just sarcasm is the example that I think is easiest to understand, but pragmatics can also be stuff like pronouns, right? If I use the word I, like I am drinking coffee, the meaning of I am drinking coffee depends on who said it, right? If I'm drinking coffee, it means I am. If you say it, if you say I'm drinking coffee, well, that means the person speaking said. Same thing. There's a bunch of contextual parameters like this. For example, about time, now. What does now mean? Well, now means the time at which it was uttered. Right now, for me, is 10:52 in the morning. So pragmatics is everything that context contributes to meaning and interpretation. Semantics is the literal meaning of words and sentences. And finally, syntax, the rules governing the structure and the construction of these sentences. The rules, kind of the logic of it, if you will. Okay. Syntax, semantics, pragmatics. So you might have noticed that these three levels of language each correspond to a theory of the philosophy of language. This is kind of a clever thing I do in my slides. Again, it's not exactly true. Once you get really deep into this literature, you'll see that it's kind of like simplification. But you might also notice, where's Chomsky? Is Chomsky on the syntax, semantics, or pragmatics side? Chomsky's a weirdo, and he doesn't really fit in these categories because, again, he just wants to do cognitive science. If I had to force him in here, I'd say he's a guy that thinks that there's such a thing as syntax, and syntax is in the brain, and that's what we should be studying. And everything else is purely pragmatics, and there can be no theory of it, so we can't do science of pragmatics. But that's Chomsky. We're going to get to Chomsky. Don't worry about Chomsky. All right, Frege. Let's start talking about the logic of language. Frege, interesting dude. Often viewed as kind of the father of the analytic tradition in the philosophy, in I guess we'd say Anglo-American philosophy, but really should be kind of German Anglo-American. 1848, 1925. Super important as a philosopher. Kind of a terrible dude, though. But, yeah, we're going to have to put that to the side for now. Frege is this really important philosopher because he did extremely pioneering work in formal logic. And, in fact, is probably, amongst a handful of people, the only philosopher, like I'd say there's, less than 5 of them who have made any significant addition to logic since Aristotle 2,000 years before. And this is not hyperbole. There's basically a huge gap between Aristotle and then what starts to happen in the 19th century with some mathematicians. So you have like maybe Leibniz, maybe Boulos, and what's his name? Anyway, I'm forgetting my history this morning, but Frege, one of a handful of people that can be said to have done anything to logic in the 2,000 years since Aristotle. In particular, his Begriffsskript, the concept script, introduced something called predicate logic. This was a huge, huge development, and much of mathematics and geometry could not be captured within Aristotle's logic. So it was actually really important that Frege kind of improved on the existing forms of logic. And I'm not going to be going too deep in what this logic looked like. Back when I was a contract faculty at Western, I did teach the formal logic class for the philosophy department, including predicate logic, including sentential logic, but I'm not going to go too deep because, frankly, when I taught that class, it was a 2-semester thing, right? It would take all of fall and all of winter to do this properly, and I can't do it in 5 minutes. But the important thing to remember is Frege, big, important, pioneering work in the developments of logic. And Frege's work on the foundation of arithmetic as well, so he was working within mathematics and the foundation of mathematics, was in fact an attempt to explain math in terms of logic, in terms of its reducibility to logic. Now, there's a really fascinating period in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century. If you're interested in the foundations of mathematics or the history of mathematical development, really exciting things were happening, especially from 1850 to 1950. Really amazing developments in logic and math. And Frege, in particular, was one of the first to ask the question whether or not math is reducible to formal logic. Because mathematics at the time did not really have what we call a foundational analysis, in the sense that we could not reduce it to a set of axioms or a set of basic truths. For a long time, we had that in geometry through Euclid, but then math became its own crazy thing, right? We had Cantor and his developments on the levels of infinity, which scandalized the mathematical community. You had, all work on infinitesimals due to Leibniz and Newton, and all this stuff kind of worked, and it was consistent, self-consistent, and had tremendous predictive power when you used them in science to make physical theories, but you didn't really have a grand unifying theory of mathematics. So Frege tried to provide this foundation, and it failed, unfortunately, due to Bertrand Russell's paradox. And commented Frege, look, hardly anything more unfortunate can befall a scientific writer than to have one of the foundations of his edifice shaken after the work is finished. So Frege tried, and then Bertrand Russell, probably one of the most famous philosophical figures of the early 20th century, kind of smashed it all down. The way Frege tried to explain math was through something called set theory, which is, again, if you're interested in the foundations of math, okay, I am, but I'm a huge nerd. You can look this up. But the basic idea was we're going to explain all of math, with a very thin ontology. We're not going to assume numbers exist in a Platonic realm. We're just going to reduce it to the logic of sets, of collections of objects. And so you can get number by you have a set, and then I can imagine that it's empty. So just imagine a basket. Baskets exist, but nothing else. I have an empty basket. Then I put the empty basket in another basket. How many things are in the second basket? Well, there's one thing. There's the basket containing nothing. So the basket with a basket in it has one object. Oh, and now I've created the number one out of nothing but set theory. So that's kind of Frege's basic approach. Right, so now I have a basket with a basket in it. I could put that in another basket, just collections of objects, and I can have the number 2, 3. You iterate that process. You get actually the natural numbers, and then Frege is very clever, and he starts doing this for huge amounts of math. Then Russell says, well, hold on. You're thinking about baskets here. Baskets with rules about what you can put in them. And he says, look, imagine the set of all sets, which are not members of themselves. Is it a member of itself? Wait, what? Yeah, the set of all sets which are not. So we're able to make collections of objects if they have certain properties. Imagine the property that you're not a member of yourself, right? Is it? Or here's a simpler one, right? There's a barber in a town that shaves all and only those who do not shave themselves. Does the barber shave himself? All right, so you have a barber. He shaves everyone who does not shave themselves. Does he shave himself? So he shaves only those who don't do it themselves, right? Does he do it himself? Well, if he does, then he doesn't, because he only shaves the people who don't shave themselves. So if he does himself, he doesn't, right? Because he only does people that don't do it to themselves. So if he doesn't do it to himself. But if he doesn't do it to himself, then great, because he only does people that don't do it to themselves. So he can do it to himself. Oh, but now he can't. But he can. But he can't. But he can. But he can't. Oh, shoot, right? So the whole So Frege allowed the construction of mathematical sets with contradictory properties, and the whole thing crumbles to the ground. And attempts to fix this problem and reground math in all of logic continued and continued for decades after that. And I'd love to give you a history of this stuff because, again, I'm absolutely fascinated by the foundations of mathematics. And I can recommend books if you are too, if you're a giant nerd. But I'm just going to stop there. But roughly, the intellectual history goes from Frege to Russell to Kurt Gödel. And Gödel kind of showed that you will never have a fully consistent axiomatic theory of mathematics. Well, it'll either be inconsistent or incomplete. Pick your poison. All right, putting that to the side. So that's kind of the Fregean project. He is applying logical insights to math. Can you ground all of math in logic? And then, of course, is also going to apply that to language. I have new logical tools. I've created the predicate logic. I have this idea of set theory. How much philosophical work can I do in terms of like explaining and giving a theory of our representational systems? If I can do it to math, what can I do to language? Oh, that's a great question. In On Sense and Reference, Frege makes a few moves in this kind of larger project. And so let's just focus on sense and reference for a sec, which is our reading for this week, well, for week 4. Frege is attempting to make this distinction about or within meaning. And he says a phrase in a natural language like English, or for him German or French, doesn't matter. Phrases will have both a sense and a reference. And this is important because multiple senses could have the same reference. So there's a distinction. So meaning isn't just a pointer. Meaning is not exhausted by reference. Meaningful phrases must have a sense, a mode of presentation. And what this does is it presents the referent to our thought in some fashion. And this is really crucial for Frege because the fact that I grasp a sense doesn't mean I realize that different senses actually have the same reference. The classic example is, I think, the morning star and the evening star. Before, we might not realize that, for example, it's actually the same planet Venus, and we might think it's two different celestial bodies. There's a morning star, there's an evening star. Two different senses, but they're actually pointing to the same thing. We just don't realize that the reference is. So the reference can't be all of meaning. There has to be something else, sense. So a sign, let me just move this, expresses a sense, which is kind of how the thought presents itself to us, and it refers to a specific entity. And we might not know everything there is to know about the specific entity, even though we're presenting it to ourselves in a way. So this is how we think of it, and this is the thing itself, and there's going to be a distinction. Now, previous philosophers had argued that meaning was reference, but this just can't be the case, says Frege. Yes, okay, the morning star and the evening star. So we do talk about this. Great. So Frege's example, morning star, the evening star, both, in fact, refer to Venus. But we had to kind of discover this, right? It had to be discovered by astronomers. So the sense of the term the morning star had something to do with the context in which we were acquainted with that specific celestial phenomena, like, oh, it's that star that rises in the morning. And the fact that both the morning star and the evening star refer to the same planet, Venus, shows that two senses, two modes of presentation, two ways of thinking about an object can in fact be about the same thing in the world, even though we don't realize it. We cannot logically deduce that the morning star and the evening star are the same object, even though they're both about the same thing. And this is kind of the basic problem that Frege opens with, right? I mean, his discussion opens about this notion of equality, not political equality, not in the sense of like in ethics are we equal, but the mathematical relation of what does it mean to say that two things are equal, that is, that they are in fact the same thing. If I say the morning star is the evening star, what am I saying when I'm saying that they are the same object? Because again, I had to discover that they are in fact the same object. So if the meaning was just purely the reference, right, saying that morning star equals evening star should not have been something I discovered. It should just be something I would already know. It would be like saying the morning star is the morning star. If I say morning star is morning star, I'm not telling you information. But if I say morning star is evening star, I am telling you information. But how could it be informative? Well, because I'm telling you something about the fact that two senses speak to the same referent. This is super technical. Right, and this is basically opposed to the view of John Stuart Mill, English philosopher, who's maintained the meaning of a proper name was just its referent. What is the meaning of a name? What it points to. All right, but again, if A is the evening star and B is the morning star, A equals A is obviously true. A equal, right? This is a priori, as we say. I don't need to investigate whether an object is identical to itself. But if I have two different names, finding out that A equals B, this is not obviously true. As Frege says, a statement like A equals B contains very valuable extensions of knowledge and cannot be established a priori. A priori just means, of course, with thought alone, without any observation. But again, if the meaning of A and B just was the referent, both 1 and 2 should be a priori. So meaning is not just reference. Because, again, this statement is a priori, this statement is a posteriori, means can be known with thought only, and 2 cannot be known only through thought. It takes investigation. It's a piece of knowledge we have to acquire through observation. All right, so what makes the difference? The sense. All right, likewise, if I think of, I don't know if I have this example on another slide here, right? Like Bruce Wayne and Batman, right? So the meaning of Bruce Wayne is a specific dude, and the meaning of Batman is also that same dude, but Bruce Wayne is Bruce Wayne. Okay, you're not telling me anything about the world. If I say Bruce Wayne is Batman, oh my gosh, right? That's the whole plot of the second movie. So, again, just to go over a priori, a posteriori one more time here, we know something a priori if we don't need any particular experience of the world, right? I don't need to, if I say 1 + 1 is 2, I'm not going to start going like, okay, 1, 1, 2. Okay, let's check again with my other hand just in case. 1, 1. I didn't discover something. I'm not going to get a research grant to put two objects together to make sure that it always makes 2. I don't need to confirm through observation the mathematical truth that 1 + 1 = 2. That's a priori, right? Once you understand the concept triangle, triangles have 3 sides, you assent to the statement with no further empirical experience required. Again, if you're a scientist and you say, I need $1 million to start my triangle research laboratory, and we're going to investigate every triangle in the universe to see if to make sure there's no 4-sided triangle out there. Make sure there's no 4-sided triangle out there? What are you talking about? It's a conceptual truth. The meaning of triangle is that it has 3 sides. You will never need to do an experiment to make sure every triangle has 4 sides. It has 3 sides, and none of them have 4 sides. It's a priori. A posteriori, right? Instead of prior, posterior, before and after. Get it? If we do need to investigate the world to determine the sentence truth or falsity. For example, I have $4 in my pockets right now. No, my pockets are empty. That's false. But can you know that a priori? No. You need to investigate the world, right? So A equals A priori, A equals B, a posteriori, even though A and B might refer to the same thing. Ha-ha. So thanks, Frege. So Frege's argument here is that if equality was a relation between the reference of all objects, every statement of equality, that two things are the same, should be a priori, but plainly they are not. So how do we explain this? The distinction between sense and reference. Multiple senses can have the same reference. And what the relation of equality is telling us is that two different senses can have the same reference. And this is true in math as well. So the object 1 + 1 and the object 2 have the same reference, even though they have different senses. They are two different ways of presenting the same piece of the same object. Right? That 1 + 1 and 2 are the same object. If you want a really trippy example, go find out, press pause, go find out if 0.99999, to infinity is equal to 1. No spoilers, just go find out. Is 0.9999 infinity equal to 1? If you're watching the video, go to the comments section and let me know whether those two senses have the same referent or not. So So what is a sense, then, if it's different from a reference? Great question. Fregean senses are not particular idiosyncratic ideas specific individuals associate in their heads, right? Senses are actually, for Frege, they're objective. They're not subjective ways in which we have our minds configured. And if you read the paper, you see that as an example of a triangle. It's actually, it seems complicated because he's kind of droning on about it, but it's actually really simple, right? If you think about the line of triangles intersecting, so I'm drawing lines through the triangle, I can describe them in different ways. I can describe it as the intersection of line C and A, or the intersection of line B and C, right? So A and B and C, they express different senses, because that's, you would find the dot, the intersection, differently. You would go about finding that dot differently. However, it is the same dot, A and B equals, and B and C contains actual knowledge, because the equality relation here coordinates two senses to one reference. How do you find the intersection? If I say A and B, I go to A and B, and then I say, oh, that's the same as C and B. Okay, let's find C and B. So it's two different ways of finding the same thing. So you can objectively describe the same point two different ways, which is what Frege means by the distinction between a sense and a reference. So language will have sense, language will have reference. Where's the logic here, guys? I chose a paper with the least amount of logic. Is just kind of his approach here. Comprehensive knowledge of the reference, says Frege, would require us to say immediately whether any given sense belongs to it, but to such knowledge we never attain. All right, so Frege here is saying, look, if we knew everything, if we were omniscient, if we had, if we were an all-knowing, godlike being, we could kind of work backwards from the reference to all possible senses the referent could have. And then we'd produce all the true statements of equality between the senses. But we're not gods, so we have to work from sense to reference, right? If we knew everything, we can work from sense to reference, but we can't. So we have to work from, right? We have to be careful, in other words, in distinguishing sense and reference. There you go. So that's a little piece of philosophy of language due to Frege. I don't link it up to his work in logic too much. I wanted to just kind of like, all right, here's the first kind of dip your toes into the philosophy of language as done in the kind of logical and analytical tradition. That's the kind of thing they were doing, and it's a pretty cool distinction to think about. All right, let's talk about Russell. I know I'm at 52 minutes here. This is a big one. I think I'm at slide 28. We're at 52 minutes. I'm just going to keep going. I know this is a dense one. Let's talk about Russell. Let's move my image here so we can see Russell's scowling face. Is he scowling? I don't know what that expression is. But in this excerpt, the Principia Mathematica proves that 1 + 1 = 2. He wrote this book, the Principia, which, again, attempts to redo Frege's project without the problems that Frege had, with the paradox. And it's 2 volumes, hundreds of pages, all symbols, and on page like 500 something, he finally proves that 1 + 1 = 2. That's Russell with his collaborator, Alfred North Whitehead. I'm just going to put myself down, maybe just over these symbols here. So Russell, 1872, 1970, a really important analytic philosopher. He wrote about everything. He wrote about ethics, political philosophy, science, language, mind, logic, and maybe most famously, attempting to continue Frege's project to ground mathematics in formal logic while dealing with the paradoxes. He also, and now we're going to do a bit of logical analysis proper, also a bit of logical analysis of really puzzling natural language expressions, such as the King of France is bald. And he's going to just kind of try to, again, deal with puzzles through logic. So here's let's just do it. Let's just do some formal logic here. I've already talked about the barber. So paradoxes of self-reference, kind of one of these things Russell was worried about. This sentence is false. All right, I've already talked about the paradoxes. I'm just going to move on because I'm already at 54 minutes here. So Russell said, look, we're going to move on from sense and reference here, by the way. So, okay, put a parenthesis on the idea of sense and reference. We're actually moving on. I'm talking about something different now. What it is another example of logical analysis in the hopes of solving puzzles about language. So Frege had a puzzle about equality. He solves it with sense and reference. Russell has a puzzle about something called definite descriptions. Right? A definite description is a sentence that aims to pick out a thing in the world, such as, it's not a proper name. A proper name would be like Mark. A description describes, as the name goes, it says, the King of France. Now, the King of France France has no king. France needs no king. France has had no king since the French Revolution. So the King of France currently has no referent. And Russell says, okay, this is going to cause some strange problems, right? In logic and metaphysics. How are we able to talk about something which has no referent? In fact, there's going to be some deeper problems here. And Russell's insight is that you can actually logically decompose definite descriptions as expressing a kind of algorithmic function, which attempts to pick out an entity and can either succeed or fail. So let's look at how he analyzes the problems that arise from definite descriptions. Now, the reason it does is you might think that the meaning of a description must be pointing to an individual, right? Not a logical function. What do you mean that a definite description is in fact a hidden, deeper logical structure, right? What do I mean when I say the Prime Minister of Canada? Trudeau, right? That guy. The Prime Minister of Canada means Trudeau. No, this is wrong, Russell says. I mean, he's not talking about prime ministers. I'm just modifying an example here. One clue is that this is wrong is that obviously prime ministers change. The Prime Minister of Canada can't mean any specific person. What it in fact means is the unique individual who satisfies a set of properties, whoever that is. Right? So the picture here has a number of distinct individuals who have satisfied in the past the description, the Prime Minister of Canada, right? So we have, Kim Campbell over here, Jean Chrétien, is that Paul Martin? Anyway, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, right? These are all individuals who have satisfied the meaning of the definite description, someone who has been a Prime Minister of Canada. All right, so the meaning of the expression can't be an individual. It's kind of maybe it's a Fregean kind of sense. So what is that sense? What is that sense? That sense for Russell will have a very specific logical structure. And this is important because if we want a good logical analysis of language, we have to have one that actually is kind of consistent and gives consistent, correct answers to basic questions. So think about this. Suppose I say the King of France is bald. Well, there is no King of France. Okay, it is not the case that the King of France is bald. Well, wait, what? So it seems that in both cases I'm saying the King of France is bald or not bald. Both of these are in fact false. However, if I say both of these are false, it seems to violate the law of excluded middle, that sentences are either true or not true. In other words, right, if I say the King of France is bald, or it is not the case that the King of France is bald, one of these should be true, one of these should be false, right? It is raining, it is not raining. One of these should be true and the other one should be false, right? That is the law of excluded middle, right? If I'm going to say of two sentences, one is the case and one or it's not the case, that should just be obviously true, right? Either A or not A should always be true. It's either one or the other. But the King of France is bald, it is not the case that the King of France is bald, seems to violate the law of excluded middle. That sentences will either be true or it is not the case that they are true. It's one or the other. It's either true or not true. Which one? But for the King of France is bald, it is not the case that the King of France is bald. It seems that both of them are false, but how can a sentence and its own negation be false? So either choice violates excluded middle. So how do we fix this? Okay, again, this is super nerdy stuff that might be hard to care about. But again, if your whole goal is to say, look, I'm going to have a logical analysis of language and explain linguistic meaning through logic, you need to have good answers to these kinds of puzzles, if that's your project. So Russell proposes that we should analyze sentences, such as the King of France is bald or the Prime Minister of Canada, as expressing a very specific logical claim. which is a claim of existence with a condition added. So when I say the King of France is bald, what I'm really saying, kind of the deeper hidden structure, is I'm saying there exists a unique King of France, and that King of France is bald. And what this analysis shows is that when I'm trying to give a negation, and negation just means I'm saying it is not the case that, I'm saying it's false, there's an ambiguity, and logical analysis uncovers that ambiguity. It's saying, is it ambiguous between it is not the case that there exists a unique King of France and that king is bald, right? So I'm denying the existence, or there exists a unique King of France and that king is not bald. So if I say the King of France, it is not the case that the King of France is bald, I could be saying he's not bald, or I could be saying there is no King of France. And what Russell is going to say is that negation 1 here is the appropriate negation, preserving excluded middle. It is not the case that there exists a unique King of France. That is the proper negation. And once we understand that there's an ambiguity here, what we call a scope ambiguity, forget that I said that, that's a technical term. What we understand, there's an ambiguity in the negation that is shown through logical analysis. We can then preserve excluded middle, and that is evidence that the analysis must be correct here. So here's some fancy, I love doing this because whenever I have fancy symbols on the blackboard or on the slides here, you know that we're doing serious philosophy. So in modern philosophy, this is not the notation that Russell used, but in modern notation, the King of France is bald would read something like this. There is an X such that X is the king, and for any king, then that king is some X, and that king is bald. Okay, what does that mean? Right, there exists a King of France, and for any entity, if that entity is the King of France, then any King of France must be that King of France. This is a fancy way of saying there's a uniqueness condition. The definite description is because there's one individual, so that's how we're going to express uniqueness in logic. For any Y such that Y is the King of France, then that particular King of France must be him. And that King of France is the property of being bald. So this is the logical breakdown of it. You don't need to remember this. You would not. There's no exam question. I do not need you to remember this. I just want you to show you what logic looks like in the formal mathematical notation. For these philosophers, everything had to be expressed in the form of this symbol system, right? Because language is this kind of math. So this is what the King of France is bald looks like in mathematical formal predicate logic notation. I shouldn't say mathematical. I should stick to its predicate logic. So that's what it looks like. So in logical precision, philosophers claim would eliminate philosophical confusion. So what Russell did with his logical analysis was, again, fix a puzzle about the law of excluded middle, and also fix a metaphysical issue, because some philosophers up to that point had claimed that meaningful statements about entities that don't exist, like the King of France, like the Golden Mountain, were taken to mean that they actually did exist in some sense, resulting in these really strange ontological views, right? So Meinong, I think, was a philosopher who said specifically, how are we able to talk about things that don't exist? Well, they must exist in some sense. They exist as an idea in the realm of ideas. And Russell was like, no, we don't need that. We just need logical analysis. Russell used Frege's logic to show that sentences about non-existent entities did not imply they somehow did exist, and in fact they would follow the normal laws of logic once we've analyzed them correctly. That's what you need to remember about this. Logical analysis can solve philosophical puzzles, can give us the correct metaphysics, can help us understand the nature of relations like equality, of the word and, of the nature of the definite description. We can give these through logic. And that's kind of the project here. So I gave you a few examples of it. Equals, the word and itself, the nature of the definite description are amenable to purely logical analysis. So that's what the project looks like. Of course, there's 100 years of people trying to figure this out. If you're interested in this tradition, I can certainly send books your way. I've just chosen a few examples to give you like a flavor of the project here. But again, we have 100 years of scholarship and people trying to do this. Okay, I know I'm at an hour and 4 minutes. This is probably, I'm never going to make a video this long again. This is the most technical of the slides here, so that's why I wanted to do it. I have only a few slides left. Bear with me. There's not a literal bear with me. Just hang out for a bit. I guess there's a bear back. There's my bear. Logical empiricists. Okay. So this new logic, Frege, Russell, did lead to a whole 20th century movement called logical positivism or logical empiricism, which attempted to ground knowledge in direct sense perception and logical inference. So what we have when we have logical empiricism, we take the new logic in language that people were doing, and then we have empiricism as an epistemology. We put them together, and boom, we can just solve all of philosophy forever. Spoiler alert, they can't. But logical empiricism will combine language with epistemology by claiming that the meaning of a sentence will be its method of verification. What a sentence means is its method of verification. And if a statement has no verification conditions, it is literally meaningless. This is logical empiricism trying to do a synthesis here, grabbing Frege and Russell, grabbing science, smashing them together, and saying, what is meaning? The meaning is its method of verification. So if a statement has no verification conditions, it is meaningless. Literally meaningless. It's nonsense. Right? It is raining outside. How do I verify? Well, I know exactly how to verify whether it's raining. I can go and look and determine if there's precipitation. And I know if I say something kind of like, at the heart of the ontological continuum is the very vibrational theory of consciousness. How do you verify that? It's nonsense. You can't. If you can't have an empirical verification condition, you're talking nonsense. Right? So let me put myself up here. Logical empiricism said that an assertion that can be verified through empirical science is meaningful, and if it's not, then it's not meaningful. Or if I say, oh, there's a teacup buried somewhere on Mars, I could tell you in principle how to verify that, right? We go sift through Martian sand. Even if it takes centuries, eventually either I determine whether there's a teacup or no teacup. If I say, the cosmic womb of potential is a metaphysical place of creation, that sounds profound, but how would we empirically verify if this sentence is true or false? What experiment, what observation, even in theory, you don't have to be able to do this observation yet, but what experiment could confirm or disconfirm it? So for the logical empiricists who are active in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, what they said is if there's no method of verification, there's no meaning. And they applied this pretty ruthlessly to philosophy. They said, look, if a philosopher is making claims that are not verifiable, that they can't even give you how you would find out if it's true or false, then it's just meaningless. Don't even listen to them. Here's a dinosaur comic. You can read this dinosaur comic if you want. I'm not going to read it out to you. We're at an hour and 7 minutes. Let me just wrap up with Rudolf Carnap, 1891-1970, arguing that, again, logical analysis combined with empirical science would eliminate philosophical pseudo-problems and get rid of bad metaphysics forever. And he says, quote, the development of modern logic has made it possible to give a new and sharper answer to the question of the validity and justification of metaphysics, including like metaphysics like we've been doing earlier in the semester about like, the nature of number, but also other kind of, more wacky stuff, metaphysics, when philosophers are saying pseudo-profound things about, vibrations, consciousness, whatever, right? How do we verify if it's true or false? If you can't, get rid of it. The researches of applied logic, or the theory of knowledge, which aims at clarifying the cognitive content of scientific statements and the meanings of the terms that occur, lead to a positive and to a negative result. What is that? The positive result is worked out in the domain of the empirical sciences. The various concepts are clarified and their connections are made explicit. But in the domain of metaphysics, and I love how, clear-cut he is about this. All of philosophy of value, all normative theory, logical analysis yields the negative results that the alleged statements in this domain are entirely meaningless. A radical elimination of metaphysics is attained, which was not yet possible from the earlier anti-metaphysical standpoints. We're going to get rid of, this includes all ethics, by the way. We can't verify ethical statements. There is no scientific way to verify ethics, therefore all of ethics is literally meaningless. This is from a great paper called, what is it called? Logical Analysis in the Elimination of Metaphysics by Carnap. You can go read it. It's actually a very fun read, and he goes full bore in his assault on metaphysics here. This meaningless, of course, meaningless itself is a pretty precise meaning for Carnap. It just means that it can be proven true or false. It doesn't mean that it's gobbledygook in the sense that if I go yakka, 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 then that's meaningless because it doesn't have, I'm just making noise. It just implies that there is no truth content. And what Carnap is going to say of sentences that are meaningless in his technical sense of meaningless actually have value, but they have value as expressions of people's attitudes towards existence. In other words, it's art. So what we have are verifiable statements that have cognitive meaning in the sense that they're scientifically verifiable, and everything else is poetry or art. And Carnap's going to go on to say that, furthermore, a lot of people that try to be really systematic in their metaphysics when they're making statements of value theory, or when they're making just kind of like statements, that I kind of think of as kind of woo, kind of stoner philosophy metaphysics, like, man, consciousness is just this vibrational quantum construct of reality. Like, all that stuff is meaningless. What you're really doing is poetry. What you're really doing is art. And the mistake, Carnap says, is that you're confusing your art for science. But art is art and science is science. And when you're expressing your attitude towards life, whether it's in your metaphysical theory or in your ethical theory, you should at least realize you are an artist and not a scientist. And don't confuse the public with your misleading theoretical form, he says. And at the end of this paper, he actually kind of gives a shout out to Nietzsche, of all people. He says Nietzsche at least realized this. When Nietzsche came to express his attitude towards life, when he gave his ethics and his metaphysical theories, he wrote a book called Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which is basically a poem, which is like a long kind of prose poem and novel where he takes an artistic form because, again, he realized this, that metaphysics is in fact an artistic project, so you should treat it as such. But it doesn't mean it's verifiably true or false in the scientific sense. All right, so that's Carnap's view. Is he right? Is he wrong? I'm going to leave it to you. I find these people absolutely fascinating. And again, I apologize for going like an hour and 10 minutes on this video. I go pretty hard, an hour and 10. I promise I'll keep things shorter moving forward. But, in real life, I'd have you in a 3-hour classroom, 2 hours and 1 hour lecture. I'd be talking at you for 3 hours if I could. So this is good. An hour 15 is pretty good. All right. If you made it this far, go to the discussion forums and say, I actually watched the whole thing. And if you made it this far and you go to the discussion forums and say, I actually watched the whole thing, I will give you +1 for your final grade. I swear I will. I'll do this. This is such a long video. All right. Thanks for watching. Week 5 coming up next.